One share, 128 pounds. 8 months later, 1,000. By November, 135. The company barely traded anything. Parliament handed it the national debt. The chancellor got shares he never paid for. Then the price came home. The cashier fled with the books, and the man who contained it rose to run the country. London, 1720. Start at the ship. The South Sea Company was incorporated in 1711. The name promises voyages. The business was debt. It took on nearly £10 million of British government debt at 6% interest. In exchange, it received a monopoly on British trade with South America, which sounds enormous right up until you read the actual contract. Under the 1713 Asiento, British subjects were authorized to carry 144,000 enslaved people to Spanish America over 30 years. 4,800 a year. That was the company's principal trade. Not spices, not silver. People under contract for 3 decades. Alongside it, 1 ship a year, 500 tons of goods to 2 fairs at Portobello and Veracruz. That was the rest of the trading empire. The Britannica of 1911 puts it about as dryly as it can be put. An exaggerated value was attached to the privilege, and that privilege formed the basis of the South Sea Bubble. So by 1719, the company had a famous name, a grim contract, very little trade, and one extremely valuable asset, a close relationship with the Treasury, and an idea. If the government's debt was the problem, the company would take it. All of it. On the 22nd of January, 1720, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Aislabie, rose in the House of Commons with a proposal. The South Sea Company would take over the entire national debt. About £51 million, most of it in annuities the government was locked into paying for decades. The holders of that debt would be persuaded to swap it for South Sea shares. The government's fixed obligation would shrink. The company would collect the difference. For the privilege, the company offered the Treasury £3.5 million. The Bank of England, which had rather assumed this was its business, bid against them. By the end of it, the company's offer had reached £7.5 million. Money, it should be said, that the company did not have. Parliament approved it in April. In the Lords, the former Lord Chancellor, Earl Cowper, warned that the measure was, his words, contrived for treachery and destruction. The bill passed anyway. It usually does. Here is the part that makes the rest of the story make sense. The profit in this scheme did not come from trade. It came from the share price itself. Each annuity holder was owed a fixed amount. The company settled that debt in shares, so the higher the share price, the fewer shares each conversion cost. At 200, a block of debt might take 1,000 shares to settle. At 600, the same block takes 1/3 as many, and every share the company did not have to hand over, it could sell. For cash, to the public, which means the company was never a passenger on the rising price. It was the beneficiary, and then, inevitably, it became the driver. It sold stock directly for money in 4 separate subscriptions, on terms the company set, and the later ones were harsher than the earlier ones. And as the historian Helen Paul records, the directors tried to inflate the price directly. For instance, by issuing loans to people they thought might buy shares. Lending your customers the money to buy your own shares. There is no version of that sentence that ends well. Then there was the other kind of persuasion, and it was not happening at the counter. The company was secretly bribing key figures in government and at court. Among those taking, according to the record, were the king's mistresses. Aislabie, the chancellor who proposed the scheme, and the Earl of Sunderland, the first Lord of the Treasury, were given stock. Not sold. Given. Fictitious holdings written into the company's books with an assured profit whenever they chose to sell them back. No money changed hands on the way in, only on the way out. It is, in its way, an elegant design. The people who approve your scheme get paid out of the rise your scheme produces. Their interest and yours point the same direction, which makes the vote in April look less like a decision and rather more like an invoice. And outside that room, nobody knew any of it, not for another year. So the price went up. At the start of 1720, South Sea stock stood at 128.5. For scale, 2 months earlier it had been about 119, and 8 years before that, 75. Nothing had happened to the ships. March 330, May 550, June 890, July 1000. Wow. Everybody wanted a piece, and dozens of brand new companies appeared to sell them one. Some had a business, some had a prospectus and a room. So the South Sea Company did something genuinely audacious. It got the bubbles banned. Legislation early in the year, a royal proclamation on the 10th of June, and 86 rival companies were abolished as illegal. The biggest bubble in the country used the law against bubbles to clear the field. It is, I think, the single most honest moment in the whole affair. The difficulty with the price that has to keep rising is that it has to keep rising. Every new buyer has to be found somewhere, and the supply of new buyers is not infinite. By September, South Sea stock was 175. By November, 135. It was not contained to one company. Bank of England stock fell from 263 to 145, which brings us to the most famous investor in the story and the one detail everybody thinks they know. Isaac Newton, master of the mint, and for years a careful, diversified investor, sold the bulk of his South Sea holdings early in 1720 at a profit of about £20,000. A few weeks later, he bought the same stock back at roughly double the price. Andrew Odlyzko, who went back through the surviving records, concludes that Newton's losses almost certainly exceeded £10,000 and plausibly the $20,000 his family later claimed, which is very roughly £20 million in today's money. He is supposed to have said that he could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. The earliest recorded version is shorter and less quotable. He could not calculate the madness of the people. The good half was added later by somebody else. Parliament met on the 8th of December, 1720, in a mood. A committee of secrecy was appointed to look inside the company. A second committee was told to catalog the director's assets, which tells you where this was going. The committee reported in February. It found insider trading, false accounts, and bribery. On the 8th of March, 1721, the Commons found John Eisleben guilty of, their words, the most notorious, dangerous, and infamous corruption. He was expelled from the House and committed to the Tower of London. The directors' estates were valued at just over £2 million. 354,000 of that was handed back to them for their maintenance. The rest went to the people who had lost money, which sounds like justice, and was, partly, because the one man who could have explained exactly how the whole thing worked was, by then, a long way outside the building. Robert Knight was the company's cashier. He kept the books, all of them, including the ones that recorded who had been given stock and had never paid for it. He left the country and he took key account books with him. He was picked up abroad and held by the Austrians. He could have been extradited. Instead, secret diplomatic arrangements were made, and the Austrians were persuaded to let him escape. He never told Parliament what he knew. Nobody in a position to insist appears to have wanted him to. Robert Walpole managed the aftermath. He blocked demands for strict regulation of the stock market, and he shielded figures who would otherwise have been named in public. Contemporaries called him the Screenmaster General. Lord Molesworth said the directors were scapegoats for the men above them. On the evidence, Molesworth was right, and the other half is also true. Walpole stopped a public fury from tearing apart the credit system the country actually ran on. Both of those things happened, and the second one is why he was kept. So here is the receipt. A trading company that barely traded handed the national debt by a parliament its directors had paid, a price engineered upward until it could not be, and a cleanup that punished exactly the people who could be spared. And the company itself? It did not die. By early 1722, it administered over 80% of the British national debt. It was finally wound up in the 1850s. If you like money stories where the villain turns out to be the paperwork, hit like and subscribe. There is a new one every week.